All right, let's get some more on this oil situation. And for more on Islamic State and its funding, I sat down with David Garenstein-Ross. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. I began by asking him if hitting ISIL's coffers was the key to its defeat.
First, I don't think that oil is the main financing of the Islamic State. There's been a lot of noise about oil for a long time, and it is significant to them. But most of the external evidence points to the contrary. For example, Ayman al-Tamimi, a researcher who's done the most work on archival Islamic State documents, found that in a one-month period where they actually had the budget for Deir ez-Zor, which is a province where they actually control an oil field, the money that they were making was only $66,000 a day. That's significant, but it wasn't the bulk of the budget for the Islamic State. What's new isn't so much the bombing of oil installations, the coalition's been bombing them for a while, but rather the bombing of oil tankers, that is when they're bringing the oil out to market. That's a good move, that is the right thing to do, but we also shouldn't overstate how important oil is to them. If you look at the Islamic State's budget, it seems very clear that the bulk of their budget now, or at least the biggest source of revenue, comes from taxation, that is, imposing taxation upon a population, or some might say extorting money from them.
That's a much more difficult problem to solve, because you're talking about an organization that is behaving like a state. If it's taxing people, how do you stop that?
You can't stop them from taxing their population. That's something that simply is going to happen. Now, some steps have been taken to try to mitigate how much they could take. For example, for a while, the Iraqi state continued to pay bureaucrats who were in territory captured by the Islamic State, so that those bureaucrats were actually working to help the Islamic State administer its social service to their public. The Iraqi state changed its way of dealing with those bureaucrats so that the Islamic State could not extort money from the bureaucrats. That also was the right thing to do, since you're at war with them. It makes no sense to pay your enemy's bureaucrats. The good news in the longer term is that given that their sources of revenue as an economy are limited, taxation isn't a great sustainable way to grow an economy, because you're taxing a population that just doesn't have a strong economic base. At the end of the day, that's going to be hard to keep up for the longer term.
It's been said that Islamic State pays well. You mentioned the kind of bureaucracy that it's created. Can we compare Islamic State with, say, Al-Qaeda in terms of how they reward financially their followers or the people that will work for them?
I don't think we can make that comparison, because when people say that the Islamic State pays better than anyone else, they're talking about in Iraq and Syria. For one thing, it's not clear that that's true today at the end of 2015. At one point it was true, but if you look at the territory controlled by Al-Qaeda, they control a lot of territory in Syria as well, and I don't think there's a recent one-to-one comparison as to how much you get paid to fight for Al-Qaeda in Syria versus how much you get paid to fight for ISIS in Iraq and Syria. But when you look outside of Iraq and Syria at other places where ISIS has a presence, such as in Libya or in Yemen, it's not at all clear that they're paying the most of any of the militant organizations. ISIS's stronghold is definitely Iraq and Syria. And if you look at Al-Qaeda, one of the reasons why I think that it's being underestimated right now is because they've built up a strong presence in a lot of areas. They have a pretty robust network and are able to get, for example, in places like Libya or Yemen, they almost certainly have much more revenue than ISIS does in those areas today.
In a nutshell, what can these coalition forces do to try and stop Islamic State financially? How can they cut off its funding? How can they put an end to this organization financially?
Bombing the tankers is a good way of reducing its funds. Look, even though you're not going to be able to take out the internal finances, such as the taxation that they impose on the population, being able to take out significant sources of revenue that are nonetheless smaller than taxation can make a big difference. For example, if you look at the U.S. budget and you're able to take out 35% of the U.S. budget, that's significant. Like, if you're able to take out 35% of the United States sources of revenue, that's very significant, even though it's not the majority of it. A second thing is I think looking at the antiquities market is very important. One reason that ISIS has been able to make money on the antiquities market is because it's a very poorly regulated market. I think this is an area where new laws can play a role. For example, making very clear that it's illegal to buy from the Islamic State, such that people who are trying to resell antiquities that clearly were purchased by ISIS business not only should have them confiscated, but also should face criminal penalties, thus providing a disincentive to do business with ISIS.